Hi everyone! Today we're going to talk about temporary greenhouse structures. So your book covers a lot of these in reading you've already done in chapter 2. They touch on caterpillar tunnels, low tunnels, and high tunnels, as well as cold frames, hothouses, and a few other structures. We're really going to focus in on these three things though: caterpillar tunnels, low tunnels, and high tunnels. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Hoop houses is an alternate name for a lot of these, and in fact, a lot of these names are used interchangeably. So it's not terribly important to try to define what is a low tunnel versus a high tunnel, because people might casually use the terms differently. Here is a picture that I took this weekend of my high tunnel. So this is in one of my fields. This is my smaller field where I grow most of my annual crops. And you'll see on the left that I have all this ranunculus that's just started to bloom, which is very exciting. This is actually the earliest I've ever had flowers. We've talked about ranunculus a bit in this class. We'll talk about it more as well. It's just a great flower, and it's a great crop to use as an example of season extension. It's a crop that really loves a cool growing environment. Once it gets to be about 70 degrees out consistently, it will start to peter out. So that's why here in zone 9B, I plant it in the fall. And people across the country in other zones are planting it. They're not even planting it yet. The first planting for them might be right now, and then they'll plant again in about a month. So it's one that I can really get a good jump start on. You'll see in the middle bed here, I have a crop called campanula that is about to bloom, and then over on the right, some more ranunculus. So we'll talk about different structures of tunnels. This is one from Farmer's Friend, and I'll list them as a resource on a later slide. It's a really good tunnel kit. It probably costs about $1,000, maybe a bit more. I think it's 12 feet by 100 feet. There are certainly cheaper options out there if you want to DIY your own tunnel. This is great because it's durable. It's really easy to put up for those of us who are not so mechanically inclined. And there are upgrades you can make to it. So you'll see here that up top, down the center, is what we call a purlin. And in this case, it's just a strap. So for upgraded tunnels, you can in fact have a rigid purlin made out of metal conduit, or some people use PVC. I don't experience a lot of wind in this location, so while it's important to have something up there running the length of the hoop house overhead, it's okay that it's not a solid purlin in this case. You'll see that I have the sides of the tunnels held up really high, and that's in order to really get a lot of airflow in there and try to keep the temperature down a little bit. The ranunculus really needs all this heat over the winter, but here in February, where it's unseasonably warm, we're starting to climb to a temperature where they're not too happy. So it's just a real balance of keeping the plastic on the tunnel, not removing it completely, but making sure we're getting lots of airflow. Here is a picture from Bear Mountain Farm. They are a farm that I will refer back to again and again because they're really innovative. They have a great YouTube channel. I recommend you all check it out. We'll be watching a few of their videos throughout this course. But you'll see in the foreground here, they have what are called low caterpillar tunnels. So these are too short to walk in. They really just cover the bed. And they are a great starting ground when you're just putting up your first hoop houses. You'll see in the background there is a high tunnel that is more like what I just showed you, what I have in the field. Although I think those might just be PVC instead of EMT, which is metal conduit. So back to the caterpillar tunnels in the foreground here. These can be done really easily and really cheaply. You can use PVC, which is a good alternative, and we've talked about this a bit, but it's really cheap. So PVC is pretty much the cheapest material you could get for this purpose. However, it does degrade in the sun after a few years, so that's something to consider. So what most people do for these tunnels would be to pound rebar or something similar into the ground, and then you can use your PVC or bent metal conduit and straddle the length of the bed and stick the PVC or EMT on top of the rebar so it's held in place. And then basically you can stretch the plastic the length of these hoops, anchor it down on either end, and then there are a number of ways you can hold it in place. There are some snap clamps that can just hold the plastic on to the hoops, but that doesn't allow for easy up and down. If you're in a completely wind-free area and you're not too concerned with getting airflow, if you're growing a crop that isn't prone to mildew, for example, you could hold down the sides of the plastic with sandbags or something similar. But what I would do is attach little hoops or carabiners at the base of most of those hoops, perhaps around the rebar, that's what I do, and then run a long rope. Basically, you're going to run it the length of the hoop, but you're going to pass it back and forth running through each carabiner. So then it cinches the plastic and you can hold up the plastic sides. The reason I'm going into detail about this is that it's a really easy way to get started with extending your season and protecting your crops outside. So let's dive into some of the reasons we might use tunnels and some of the applications. So what are the benefits of temporary structures? Like I just said, there's just a much lower barrier to entry than a big permanent greenhouse structure. They're way cheaper, they're way easier to construct. If you don't own land, as I don't, yet you're trying to make a go at this crazy world of agriculture or horticulture, they are a great investment to make because you're not worried if you need to move and take them down and reconstruct them somewhere else. So there's just a lot of flexibility all around. Who uses these? So new farmers or new growers for whom this is their first structure, they've never worked in a greenhouse, this might be a good way to get started. Nurseries that might have permanent structures but need additional covered space, either they're expanding or they're growing a crop that needs a bit more heat, or they are short on cash flow and just need a quick system. The reason that I first learned about tunnels, low tunnels and high tunnels, was to really take advantage of the shoulder seasons for growing flowers. So this is the fall and the spring. So let's take my ranunculus, for example. I showed you a picture in the first slide. These are really blooming right now in the shoulder season. If I didn't have colored space, I wouldn't have flowers to sell until maybe late March, maybe April, depending on that particular weather that winter. But it really allows you to extend the season and take advantage of the spring and take advantage of the fall. An example of how I might use a tunnel like this in the fall is to grow chrysanthemums or mums. They're a great cut flower. They're kind of back in popularity. And they bloom in October. And some years I've had a really early frost and it's taken out my mums. So a good way to make sure that you can harvest those flowers before frost comes is to erect a low caterpillar tunnel over them. It's not too hard, and then you'll know that you can harvest them through October, maybe even into November. Here are a few different setups that I wanted to point you towards. On the left, this is a sea of low caterpillar tunnels. This can be a great setup. However, when I graduated from my low caterpillar tunnels to my high tunnels, I found it was just a lot less labor intensive once they were up, because imagine that you have plastic covering just a single bed. You are cinching it up in the afternoon, closing it in the evening. It's opening and closing and opening and closing. And you're doing that the length of every bed on both sides, whereas my current tunnels cover 3 beds, so I only have to, it's just that much less walking, that much less opening and closing, which really adds up. So I'm not sure what this application is here, what they're growing in there. under that sea of plastic, but just wanted to point that out. In the middle here are tunnels similar to mine, but you might see these all over California for a bunch of different crops. So another common thing you might see is where the plastic doesn't extend all the way to the ground, where there's a ridge line or there's a long, a 2x4 or a thin piece of wood at about shoulder height, spanning the length of the house, and the plastic ends there. It's often secured into place with wiggle wire or a different use there. But so air is always allowed to flow through the base of the structure, but it's always covered. If you look at the picture on your right here, we'll see berries. A lot of raspberries and blackberries are grown this way, especially as you go down south. San Luis Obispo comes to mind. There's acres and acres of raspberries and blackberries grown this way with just a little bit of protection, but with plenty of airflow. Under what conditions might people use temporary structures? So as we said, they're very versatile, and it's a good way to alter your zone. So in warm zones, I'd say 8+, here we are in 9B. We can grow throughout the winter. Ranunculus and lettuce are some good examples of that. We can take advantage of our mild climate and make it even more mild. In cold weather zones, I'd say 7 and below, you can really get a boost for summer crops, and crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, melons, eggplant, celosia as a flower. These crops might not do that well in some of these really cold weather zones. I'm thinking more of the lower end of the spectrum here, maybe zone 4, zone 3, zone 5. They can in fact get a lot better quality crop, a better tasting tomato if grown in hoop houses as opposed to grown outdoors. I've been watching the weather across the country, as I'm sure you guys have as well too, and just all the farmers I know in these really cold zones are getting tons of snow loads on their hoop houses right now. And they're spending all their time and energy trying to take care of their structures because the snow gets so heavy, and then the hoop houses can just cave in, or they can fly away like a sail. Some sources for hoop houses. There are tons of instructions out there for DIY kits. Bear Mountain Farm is one. I'll link to a video in this week's course. They have many videos on this topic, so I'll just share the first one, and you guys can follow along on their YouTube channel if you're interested. They just are really innovative and really accessible. I really like the way they teach. BuildYourOwnGreenhouse.com has some great resources and plans for small greenhouses and hoop houses. Farmer's Friend is where I bought my tunnels from, and they are cornering the market on these easy to construct, relatively cheap hoop houses. It's a really interesting company to watch because it just shows me that demand is far exceeding supply at this point for these easy to put up structures. Johnny's Seeds has a lot of resources, and they sell hoop benders, which allow you to buy 10-foot lengths of EMT and bend them into 3 or 4-foot widths to cover your beds. Greenhouse Megastore is where I buy a lot of plastic sheeting for greenhouses. All right, that's it. Thanks for joining me this week.